So welcome to my channel. So I'm still on the topic of slave trade and how inhumane it was and why currently reparations are a must and compensation. So because there's also a gradual trend of erasing the slave trade history to make it look good. So there's a talk of people saying that slaves left Africa willingly to go to America to work there. But slave trade was very inhumane. One of the most inhumane activities or atrocities against mankind, against fellow man. So America, however successful they have to face this history of slave trade and correct it. Otherwise, everything else they're doing is just hypocrisy. So yeah, we have many books about atrocity of slave trade, even movies. So yeah, we have this book of The American Slave Coast, the history of slave breeding industry by Ned Constance Sublette. It's an American book. In this book, he has records of or testimony of former slaves who narrate their own experience. So today I want to talk about slave breeding. So after the end of the slave trade, you see a time came when the slave trade was banned, African slave trade, through the works of people like William Wilberforce in UK. So in America, they banned slave trade in 1808. That means that the South, American South, who are depending on the slave labor, they could no longer get slaves from Africa. So what happened? Other states like Virginia and Maryland, they embarked on slave breeding. This means that they could take some slaves and force breed them, the way you can breed cows or even horses. So they will have some slaves who are meant for work, but others, a man, for example, will be meant for breeding with females. So a young girl could be forced to breed with a male slave from very early years. So we shall look at this. It was mostly forced slave breeding. They were forced to breed like cattle. Here we have testimony of some women or some girls who are slaves, and they were forced to carry pregnancies almost every year. So a young girl of about 30 will have almost 7 children, or even more, because of the forced slave breeding. And then there's also rape cases whereby the slave owners were raping the slaves. So let's look at this area of slave breeding to show that slavery was one of the most shameful parts of our history as mankind, together with colonization, among others. Yeah, so let's look at this book and the testimony of these former slaves. So this book, I think this is one of the first pages. It details how Virginia was a place of slave breeding. So here they write that Virginia was the mother of slavery. That's the state of Virginia, wrote Lewis Hughes. So Lewis Hughes was one of the slave descendants who wrote about the slave experience. So Virginia, that state, was the mother of slavery. It wasn't just a figure of speech. So years after this African slave trade was prohibited in 1808, the southern economy depended on slave breeding industry, of which Virginia was the #1 supplier. So when Hughes, this author, was born in 1832, that slave breeding market was expanding sharply. So he says, it's open quotes, "My father was a white man and my mother was black," Hughes wrote. This meant that he was classified as a merchandise at birth because children inherited the free or enslaved status of the mother, not the father. It had been that way in Virginia for 170 years already when Hughes was born. So this means that legally those days, the status of the newborn follows the status of the womb. Fathers pass inheritance down. Mothers passed slavery down. This ensured a steady flow of sellable human product from the wombs of women who had no legal right to say no. So in this slave breeding, women were forced to breed with their fellow slaves, but also women they could be forced to breed through rape. They were raped by the slave owners, the whites. That's why the child who is born, whether the child was born through rape by the slave owners, so the child will be mulatto, or the child was born through the slave breeding of a black slave with another male slave, the child will inherit the slavery status of the mother. So the slavery was passed down from mother to child. So the womb of the woman was seen as a merchandise or as an investment by those people. So most of the enslaved African Americans lived and died without writing their experiences because they were not taught how to write. But this Lewis Hughes, who was mixed between white father and a black slave, he was able to study and then write his experiences. So the slave breeding was real, and this state of Virginia and even Maryland, there was a center of slave breeding. So according to Hughes, who is giving our testimony, he was sold at the age of 12. So he says that a slave could be sold many times. It was up to the owner to decide when to sell him or her. So here's a testimony about how he describes the breeding women, the breeding slaves or men. So here is a detailed description of a deal that took place on the road in South Carolina. So here is this Hughes, who is the narrator, is describing what he saw when it was being sold. So when they were sold, they were being transported from one place to another. So on the way, they saw a deal. Two white people, slave owners, making a deal about how to buy slaves. So they're describing here. So the stranger, who was a thin, weather-beaten, sunburned figure, then said he wanted a couple of breeding wenches. So wench is a lady or a girl. He wanted a couple of breeding wenches and will give as much for them as they will bring in Georgia. He then walked along our line as we stood chained together and looked at the whole of us. Then turning to the women, asked the prices of the two pregnant ones. And so the slave breeding was very active. And a woman who is pregnant also was sold because the child she's carrying is a future slave. So he continues. Our master replied that these were two of the best breeding wenches in all Maryland. That one was 22 and the other only 19. That's their years. That the first was already the mother of 7 children. Now, they're saying the first one was 22 years. So she's 22, that slave lady, and already she was a mother of 7 children. So she had been forced to breed. So calculate, if she's 22 years and she has 7 children, at which age did she start giving birth? At which age? So they began breeding them early, forced breeding. And the other, the one who is 19, had 4. So this slave owner is describing the ability of these slave girls to give birth to children. Very many. So they're treating these women, slave women, as livestock. They don't care about their health, well-being. They're forced to breed. Because those breeding is money. So this owner is saying that the first one had 7 children, and the other, who is 19, 4. And that he had himself seen the children at the time he bought their mothers. So the mothers were bought. After they give birth, they were even separated from their children. And as such wenches, the ladies, will be cheap at $1,000 each. So each of the ladies who were breeding were $1,000 each. Yeah. So they were bargaining how to buy them. But eventually the guy said he would pay $900 for the pair. So this is how things were. This is how things were in those days. So slave breeding was real. So try to imagine that a girl who is 22 has given birth to 7 children. And the one who is 19, 4. Put that in your mind. If you are 19-year-old, if you have a 19-year-old daughter or relative, imagine if she has 4 children. Or if you have a 22-year-old girl, like these university students, imagine if she has 7 children. And because she's sold from another slave owner, they'll keep on force breeding her. So she'll even give us many children in her lifetime, more than 20. That is how the number of African American slaves increased. Because at this time, the African slave trade, Atlantic slave, has been banned. So the slave owners of the South had to find another way of getting the supply of free slave labor. Because the economy of the South, the cotton and others, depended on the African slave labor. Let's go on. So here are some of the statistics of how the number had grown. So by that age of 1820s or 1860, most of the slaves had been born in America through slave breeding, majority. These are the statistics: Virginia and Maryland, New England and Mid-Atlantic, the Gulf Coast, Barbados, etc. So slave breeding had increased the population of the slaves very much. So Thomas Jefferson described that the South did not only produce tobacco, rice, sugar, and cotton as commodities for sale, it produced people. So Jefferson is very honest there. Because like Virginia, they were even selling the slaves as commodity. So Virginia had been slave breeding since the 17th century. It had the oldest, most deeply rooted African American population and the largest, with far more slaves than any other state, and with much of the land already burned out for tobacco farming by the time of the Declaration of Independence. The agricultural productivity per laborer in Virginia was low. This means that by the time of War of Independence, 1776, Virginia land had been over-cultivated. So they were producing less crops. So the most profitable thing for Virginia planters to do with the growing slave population was to sell young people for traders for shipment down south. This is why the Virginia became a slave breeding center, because their land had been cultivated so much, and now the land was less fertile. So they began to slave breed the slaves and to sell them to the further south states like Mississippi, Tennessee, Georgia, etc. So by 1800s, most of the slaves in America were not from Africa. They had been slave bred. Now, today many years have gone by, and many guys can't imagine this. But try to imagine how people who own livestock, how they force breed them. So there was even I've read even some of these pages here in this book. Just how you can have in a community one bull that is herd by neighboring people in a particular community. In the same way, there used to be male slaves who could be hired like that. One farmer could hire him this month, the next one will hide the next month, like that. So this individual was known for his strength in area of breeding. So you can find that in that vicinity, that area, that county, very many of the slaves who were born, they had one father, the same father. Almost 30 or even more had the same father. So we had such people. So that's how the slave breeding was done. But think about the women who are being used. Like we have seen, they began to breed them very early. Young girls, even at 10 years, they were being forced to breed. Some were raped. And that's how the southern agriculture of cotton and other things, that's how they continued receiving the supply of slaves from Virginia, Maryland, and others. Because by this time, the African slave trade, transatlantic, had been banned by 1808. So slave trade was very inhumane. Yeah, so slave was a big business in America and even Europe. So this is how the slave auctions were announced. So just the way even today you can announce auction of property, auction of a car, or company property. That's the same way the auctioning slaves, because slaves was viewed as merchandise. So here's some of the posters for slaves auction. These were published in the newspapers, among other places. So they were seen as merchandise. This 1823, July 23rd, 1823. Slaves at auction. As likely, you can see there. So they were selling them depending on they had to name their qualities. Whether he's a cook, a house servant, even the age, to make their value go high. This is the 1823 auction. And then this other one is 1859. Jacob August. I will sell by public auction on Tuesday for next quote. 8 valuable family servants of 1 Negro man, a first-rate field hand, a boy, 17 years age, who is a trusty house servant, 1 excellent cook, 1 housemaid, 1 seamstress. The balance are under 12 years of age, so they're very young. At this age, they've been taught how to be a cook, how to be a housemaid, seamstress, even how to breed. So they are sold for no fault, etc., etc. These are all auction posters, which are on the newspapers. So those days, slaves were common property. And though this is a picture of how auction looked like, you can see here we have the real slaves being auctioned here. Very young children here, you can see. And their mothers, etc. And then these ones here are the would-be buyers. They will be buyers. So they are being sold there, even here. So the one being sold is being placed on top of this higher thing. And here is the auctioneer person. And they bargain, they sell. Here's a will-be customer, etc. These are the auction used to take place. So even the ones which came from Africa, they were sold like this at the port. And even the ones which had been bred, they were sold like this. So you'll find that even these children here, these children, they have their value. Because this child will be a future slave. So someone buying this woman and a child is guaranteed to have 2 slaves, the woman and the child, etc. So that's how they used to value them. Here's a picture of slaves traveling. See the way they were chained. Look at the way they are chained there. And here's a woman with her child carrying this luggage. Look at the way they are chained on the head. Plus even the children, they are just chained. And they could walk like this for many miles, because by then there were no aeroplanes. And then the trains were for mostly the aristocrats. So slaves could walk like this, but not the slave master would use horses. They relied on horses. So try and watch that movie called Django Unchained and see how the slaves were moving across states from Mississippi to Alabama to Georgia. This is how they used to travel on barefoot. And yes, he's the guy who is in charge of them, carrying the whip. Just so you can transport animals. Just so the Maasai transport the animals. There's always someone who is beating the animals, which are walking slowly, etc. This is how they used to be treated, very inhumanely. So whether you like it or not, this is the history of America. This is America's history. This example of a strong slave who could fetch a very high price in those auction markets. So most of the slave breedings, if you find a mind like this, could breed so many women in that community. Also, it could work in the farm, so it could fetch a very high price. This is how the people used to value, how they used to rate the slaves. So slaves had many roles. Some were used for breeding, like you have seen, farm work. But then some were tend to be physically muscular to entertain the white people. Even that movie of Django Unchained, you could see in that movie, those who have watched it, there are those slaves who are wrestling, fighting to entertain the slave owners, like this. Similar to what the Romans used to do, how they used to train their gladiators to entertain them. Someone could be like this. They were trained to have muscle, so they can entertain the whites by this wrestling. And you could find that in this wrestling, they could even be told to even kill. Wrestle until you kill your competitor, until blood comes out, like in that movie of Django Unchained, or just like gladiators, to entertain those farm owners. And then they could even bet. They could bet on who will win. So if, let's say, you are this slave here, and your owner bets on you, and then you win, you will earn him money. He will earn money. So you'll become a prized possession. Look at even that movie of Roots. They could train their slave to win for them championships. So these are all kind of things which are done. You can have the slave being trained to fight, or the slave training animals like horses to fight. Those are all roles of slaves. Also, in Florida, we have had reports that slaves' children could be used as alligator or crocodile baits. They could place the black children near the river where the crocodiles, so that crocodile can come, or alligator, to come to those children as a trap. And then those white hunters, they could now shoot that alligator to sell their skin. So the skin of the alligator was very valued even today. But they could use the children of the slaves as alligator or crocodile baits. So they didn't value the blacks. They didn't value the children of the blacks. They were just used like pets. Just so you can use your dog as a bait, etc. So this is all part of the history of America, Europe, the Caribbean, and this world. We cannot run away from it. This is a history. So as we are talking now, people are trying to erase this history, to make it look like slavery never took place. That these blacks, they went to America by themselves. But you have seen that the slaves were taken from West African coast, even Central Africa, even East Africa, to America, and even Europe. And then when the slavery was banned in 1808, the state of Virginia and even Maryland, they began to breed, forced breeding of slaves. And that kept the supply of slaves to the south to plant cotton and other things, and even do all these kind of things at the pleasure of the slave owners. Until 1865, when Abraham Lincoln ended slavery, through the Emancipation Proclamation. However, slavery in reality is still existing even today, in other different forms. So that's the history of slavery. And I think next time I shall look at colonialism, because they are all related. They all show how Black people have been misused and exploited in this world. And today, we are demanding for reparations for these slaves, their descendants, and even compensation for the colonialized African countries. So it's time to say the truth about the past history. So the history of this world is dirty, and there's no running away from it. So let's see your comments about this issue of slavery, among others. So there are many books around that you can read. There are movies also you can watch, like Django Unchained, 12 Years a Slave, where Lupita Nyong'o was acting, Amistad, etc. And it's also very embarrassing to find former US President Barack Obama. He's saying that there's no need for reparations. That is very shameful. Mostly these Democrats, and even Obama, they're dismissing the issue of reparations. Even Republicans, in this thing, they are united. But you find that the history is there. There's no running away from it. And like I said last time, like Martin Luther used to say that, I have a dream that one day the kids of the slave owners will play with the kids of the slaves. Me, I have a dream that one day, the kids of the slave owners will beg the kids of the slaves to please take the reparations. And one day there will be justice, eventually. So far we are in denial. And even these European countries will return the artifact they stole from African countries. And even the bodies of those whose bodies they stole. Like that Ethiopian king, prince, whose body was stolen by, I don't know, the British, among others. All these things, it's now time to say the truth. And like the Bible says, say the truth, and the truth shall set you free. That's the end for today. So we'll meet in the next video. Otherwise, let me see your comment in the comment section, and thank you very much.